Knowledge Products presents Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville.
The gradual development of the principle of equality is a providential fact. It has all the chief characteristics of such a fact. It is universal, it is lasting, it constantly eludes all human interference, and all events, as well as all men, contribute to its progress. The gradual and progressive development of social equality is at once the past and the future of mankind. To attempt to check democracy would be to resist the will of God.
These words are from the introduction to Democracy in America, the first part of which was published in Paris in 1835. Its author was a 30-year-old French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville. Democracy in America is at once a masterpiece of political philosophy and the best character analysis of the American people ever written. While Democracy in America was being published, Europe was still in the grip of a conservative reaction that followed the French Revolution and the fall of Napoleon. Classical liberal ideas were a force in public life in France and England, but even there, political power was in the hands of a small minority. Elsewhere, the prevailing spirit was that of Prince Metternich, the minister of the Austrian Empire, and a sworn enemy of classical liberalism, nationalism, and democracy. When uprisings against this rigid order did occur, they were quickly and easily crushed. Democracy in America implies that this seemingly triumphant reactionary order is actually doomed. In this work, Tocqueville challenges the official ideology of his time, seeking instead to understand and to some degree to shape the coming world of equality. Some may consider this ironic, given Tocqueville's background. Alexis Charles-Henri Clarel de Tocqueville was born in Paris in 1805. He was descended from Norman nobility, one of the oldest aristocratic families in France. One ancestor had fought with William the Conqueror at Hastings in 1066. An English friend, Mrs. Simpson, daughter of the economist Nassau Sr., described the young aristocrat.
In person, he was small and delicate. He had very thick and rather long black hair, soft yet brilliant black dark eyes, and a finely marked brow. The upper lip was long, and the mouth was wide, but sensitive and expressive. His manner was full of kindness and playfulness, and his fellow countrymen used to say of him that he was a perfect specimen of the gentleman of the old regime. Although he had a keen sense of humor, his countenance was sad in repose. Indeed, the basis of his character was sad, partly from sensitiveness, partly from ill health.
Tocqueville's family was indeed rooted in the old regime of France. His great-grandfather, Chrétien Guillaume de Malesherbes, for instance, had been a conspicuous figure during the time of the French Enlightenment in the mid-18th century. Although as a minister of Louis XV, Malesherbes was responsible for the censorship of books, he was also a personal friend of many philosophes and sympathetic to their ideas. He even helped the philosophes get around the censorship and publish their famous encyclopedia. Years later, old and ailing, Malesherbes came out of retirement to act as defense attorney for Louis XVI, now on trial for treason before the Revolutionary Convention. The king was found guilty and executed, and so was Malesherbes. Others in Tocqueville's family were also guillotined during the Reign of Terror. In fact, his father and mother were both awaiting execution as counter-revolutionary aristocrats when Robespierre suddenly fell from power and the Reign of Terror ended. When Alexis' father, Hervé de Tocqueville, left prison, his hair had turned completely white. He was 22 years old. Alexis' mother appears to have been emotionally scarred by the experience. Afterwards, a melancholy aura clung to her, which probably affected her son's personality. Later, Tocqueville recalled an incident from his childhood.
I remember, as though it were yesterday, a certain evening in my father's chateau. A family festival had brought us and our nearest relations together. The servants had retired. We were all sitting about the hearth. My mother, who had a sweet and touching voice, began to sing an air relating to Louis XVI and his death. When she ceased, we were all weeping, not for the personal sufferings they had undergone, not even for the loss of so many of our blood in the Civil War and on the scaffold, but for the fate of a man who had died 15 years earlier and whom most had never seen. But that man had been the king.
When the Bourbon kings were restored to the throne after Napoleon's fall, Alexis de Tocqueville served as prefect in various cities. Yet he was never a reactionary, avid to wipe out all the liberal gains of the past decades. Thus, in the mental ambience of his early years, Alexis de Tocqueville found not only an ancient aristocratic heritage and a deep-rooted loyalty to the French monarchy, but also an openness to liberal ideas and the recognition that tradition must be tempered with progress. As a child, Tocqueville was educated by a kindly old priest, the Abbé Lisieux, whom he dearly loved. His Catholic faith, however, could not survive acquaintance with the writings of skeptical philosophers. As a teenager, Tocqueville wrote down in his notes,
"There is no absolute truth. If I were asked to classify human miseries, I should rank them in the following order: 1. Disease, 2. Death, 3. Doubt."
Tocqueville continued his studies, preparing for a career in law. In 1827, he was appointed an official at the law court in the town of Versailles, in the department where his father was prefect. But the profession of law did not appeal to Tocqueville. He wrote to a childhood friend,
"You ask me how I am finding my new position. This is not something I can answer in a single word. I have a need to excel that will torment me cruelly all my life. But I am beginning to fear that with time I will become a law machine, like most of my fellows, specialized people, if ever there were any, as incapable of judging a great movement and of guiding a great undertaking as they are well fitted to deducing a series of axioms and to finding analogies and antonyms. I would rather burn my books than reach that point."
During Tocqueville's time at Versailles, he met another young aristocrat named Gustave de Beaumont. Tocqueville and Beaumont became fast friends. Together, they pursued an intensive course of reading. They studied the economics of Jean-Baptiste Say, who was then proselytizing for the free market and free trade ideas in France. They paid particular attention to the modern historians, whom they hoped could shed light on the tumultuous events of the past few decades. The historian François Guizot made a lasting impression on Tocqueville. Guizot wanted to break away from a narrow concentration on the doings of governments. He felt that history should be presented as the history of civilization. As Guizot put it,
"It is by the study of political institutions that the majority of writers, scholars, historians, and publicists have sought to know the state of society, the degree or the kind of its civilization. It would have been wiser to study first society itself in order to know and understand its political institutions. Before becoming causes, these institutions are effects. To understand political institutions, it is necessary to know the various social conditions and their relations."
After listening to one of Guizot's lectures at the Sorbonne, Tocqueville wrote a note to himself.
"The history of civilization aims and must aim at embracing everything at the same time. One must examine man in all the positions of his social existence."
In his lectures, Guizot also announced the grand and pivotal theme of modern history, the struggle between the aristocracy and the rising middle class.
In France there has occurred a genuine war, such as the world knows between two peoples foreign to each other. For 13 centuries, the conquered people struggled to shake off the yoke of the conquering people. Our history is the history of this struggle. In our times, the decisive battle was fought. It is called the Revolution.
This was a lesson Tocqueville would remember and later use. Meanwhile, the King of France, Charles X, was attempting to restore something like the old regime, with increased influence for the aristocracy and Catholic Church, and with supreme power for himself. Better, Charles once said, to saw wood for a living than to reign in the manner of the King of England. He was sadly out of step with the times. Moderates, liberals, and the common people of France united to overthrow Charles. He was the last of the Bourbon kings of France, the last of the legitimate line. His replacement was King Louis-Philippe. Tocqueville was in a quandary. His family had close ties to the House of Bourbon and considered it a point of honor to serve the legitimate rulers. But Tocqueville saw that Charles was true to the saying about the Bourbons: they never learn and they never forget. Charles schemed to repeal the French Revolution, a goal which Tocqueville considered absurd. Reluctantly, Tocqueville and Beaumont swore an oath of loyalty to the new regime. Still, their law careers appeared blighted. They resolved to make a fresh start. The great republic of the West, the United States, fascinated them. After all, the American example, the Revolutionary War, the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, and later the Bill of Rights, had a great impact on France. The Parisian philosophes looked on Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson as comrades in arms. The Marquis de Lafayette, still an important political figure in France in the 1820s, was the living symbol of the alliance of French and American liberalism. Beaumont was a friend of the Lafayette family, and later he would marry one of Lafayette's granddaughters. Tocqueville and Beaumont decided to see and judge this new society for themselves. They decided to visit America. In 1831, Tocqueville and Beaumont applied to the French government for a commission to study the penitentiary system in America. But their private plans far outstripped a report on the punishment of criminals. Beaumont wrote home,
"We contemplate great projects. First, we will accomplish as best we can the mission given us. But while doing the penitentiary system, we will see America. Wouldn't a book be a fine one if it gave an exact idea of the American people, showed their history in broad strokes, painted their characters in bold outline, analyzed their social state, and corrected so many of the opinions we have that are erroneous on this point? We are laying the foundations of a great work, which should make our reputation someday."
Crossing the Atlantic took 35 days. On May 10, 1831, they arrived in New York, which Tocqueville found imposing.
New York is located in one of the most admirable sites I know, with an immense port at the mouth of a river. It is the key to Northern America. Through it, each year arrive thousands of foreigners who will populate the wilderness of the West. Its population, which was only 20,000 souls 50 years ago, is today 230,000. It is a clean city, built of brick and marble, but without noteworthy public monuments.
Within a month, Tocqueville began to organize his impressions of the new nation and to sketch the outlines of a theory. He had already identified one of the keys to the riddle of an America that was vastly diversified, yet harmonious and stable. That key was self-interest, or private interest. He wrote home, describing the nature of this self-interest.
Imagine, my friend, if you can, a society formed of all the nations of the world, English, German, French, people having different languages, beliefs, opinions. In a word, a society without roots, without memories, without prejudices, without common ideas, without a national character, yet 100 times happier than our own. What serves as the link among such diverse elements? What makes all of this into one people? Interest, that is the secret. The private interest that breaks through at each moment. The interest that, moreover, appears openly and even proclaims itself a social theory.
Tocqueville and Beaumont were showered with attention and hospitality, both by public authorities and by private citizens. The two Frenchmen mingled with Americans of different social classes, observing and absorbing impressions. Above all, they asked countless questions and listened carefully to the answers. Tocqueville expressed his admiration in a long letter home.
These people incontestably are situated higher on the moral scale than among us. I especially admire two things here. The first is the extreme respect people have for the law. Alone and without public force, it commands in an irresistible way. The second thing I envy the people here is the ease with which they do without government.
By government, Tocqueville probably means the central government, since democracy in America describes the state, and especially the local authorities, as quite active. Still, the contrast with his native land was remarkable. In a letter, he wrote,
"What is most striking is the spectacle of a society marching along all alone, without guide or support, by the sole fact of the cooperation of the individual wills. In spite of anxiously searching for the government, one can find it nowhere, and the truth is that it does not, so to speak, exist at all. The government is so small a thing here that I cannot conceive how it is so large in France."
Tocqueville and Beaumont traveled through the United States. From New York, they headed upstate, stopping at Sing Sing to inspect the prison, which was already famous. Next, they proceeded across New York State to Buffalo, then a frontier town. By steamer, they traveled to Detroit, the home, they estimated, of 2,000 or 3,000 souls. They pressed on to the limits of settlement. Eventually, they traveled as far as Green Bay to observe the Indians. A steamboat brought them back to Detroit and then to Buffalo, where they made their way north. The falls at Niagara left these two eloquent young men practically speechless. After studying Montreal and Quebec City, Tocqueville and Beaumont departed for New England. Their destination was Boston, the center of culture and intellect in America. There they spent a month. Then it was across Connecticut, back to New York, and on to Philadelphia, and to Baltimore, where they visited the great patriarch of the city, Charles Carroll, 95 years old, and the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence. In Baltimore, they witnessed firsthand, for the first time, the institution of slavery. They were taken to an asylum, where a young black man screamed in terror. They were told that he lived in constant fear of a certain slave trader who had mistreated him badly. The two travelers were deeply moved. Perhaps it was this experience that decided Beaumont to write his book on America, the novel Marie, or Slavery in the United States. As they traveled on, Tocqueville was stirred by the splendor of nature, the forests and mountains, rivers and waterfalls, but it made him somber as he reflected that someday nature would succumb to the ceaseless activity of man.
It is this idea of destruction, this concept of near and inevitable change, which gives so original a character and so touching a beauty to the solitudes of America. One sees them with melancholy pleasure. One hastens in a way to admire them. The idea of this natural and wild grandeur which is to end mingles with the superb images to which the march of civilization gives rise. One feels proud to be a man, and at the same time one experiences I know not what bitter regret at the power God has given us over nature.
The two friends made their way down the Ohio to the bustling riverport town of Cincinnati. In freezing December, they proceeded down the Mississippi to Memphis. Here, Tocqueville learned something of the strange political ways of democracy on the American frontier. He noted in his diary,
2 years ago, the inhabitants of the district sent to Congress an individual named David Crockett, who has had no education, can read with difficulty, has no property, no fixed residence, but passes his life hunting, selling his game to live, and dwelling continuously in the woods.
On board ship, Tocqueville and Beaumont conversed at length with the former governor of Tennessee, Sam Houston. By New Year's Day, they were in New Orleans. It took them another 3 weeks to reach Washington, D.C. There, Tocqueville studied at close quarters the federal government, so little in evidence thus far. They spent a busy week meeting prominent statesmen, including President Andrew Jackson, who did not impress them. By now, their superiors in France were urging them to return home. They finally set sail for France on February 20th, 1832, on the same ship that had brought them to America, Le Havre. Back home in France, Tocqueville and Beaumont faced the task of reporting on American prisons. Tocqueville had little heart for it. Thus, although both names appear as authors, the report, entitled On the Penitentiary System in the United States and Its Application in France, is largely Beaumont's work. Meanwhile, Beaumont abandoned the idea of collaborating on a great book on American society. Tocqueville undertook it alone. He arranged his extensive notes and diaries and continued his research into everything pertaining to the United States. Tocqueville also resumed his many contacts in the French and especially the Parisian world of politics and letters. He was closest to the Doctrinaires, a group led by Guizot and Pierre-Paul Royer-Collard, who became a mentor to him. The Doctrinaires avoided the extremes, both of revolutionary upheaval and of a reactionary blotting out of the preceding 40 years. They were men of action and thought. Through their political activity and journalism, as well as through their books and lectures, they promoted their solution for the political problems of France: to consolidate the gains of the revolution within the framework of a constitutional monarchy, but with a restricted suffrage. These theories deeply influenced Tocqueville. In the author's introduction to the 1835 volumes of Democracy in America, which constitute Part 1 of that work, Tocqueville sketches the aim, approach, and major themes that will dominate the whole work. Equality of condition most impressed him about the United States. He writes,
I soon perceived that the influence of this fact extends far beyond the political character and the laws of the country, and that it has no less effect on civil society than on the government. It creates opinions, gives birth to new sentiments, founds novel customs, and modifies whatever it does not produce. This equality of condition is the fundamental fact from which all others seem to be derived, and the central point at which all my observations constantly terminated.
Tocqueville applies this insight to Europe.
I then turned my thoughts to our own hemisphere, and I sought to discern there something analogous to the spectacle which the New World presented to me. I observed that equality of condition, though it has not there reached the extreme limit attained in the United States, is constantly approaching it, and that the democracy which governs the American communities appears to be rapidly rising in power in Europe.
As Tocqueville later told the English classical liberal John Stuart Mill, America was only the frame. My picture was democracy. According to Tocqueville, the democratic revolution had been underway for centuries. He looked back 800 years to the 11th century. At that point, all power was wielded by a small number of noble families. It was the height of inequality. Since that time, every development has diminished the great and raised up the lowly. Peace and commerce, as well as war and conquest, fostered greater equality. Everything converged on the same goal, equality of status, or, as Tocqueville puts it, democracy.
All men have aided it by their exertions, both those who have intentionally labored in its cause and those who have served it unwittingly. The gradual development of the principle of equality is therefore a providential fact. The whole book that is here offered to the public has been written under the influence of a kind of religious awe, produced in the author's mind by the view of that irresistible revolution.
Clearly, Tocqueville's aim is not purely abstract or scholarly. For him, analysis and understanding are the prelude to political action.
The Christian nations of our day seem to me to present a most alarming spectacle. The movement which impels them is already so strong that it cannot be stopped, but it is not yet so rapid that it cannot be guided. Their fate is still in their own hands, but very soon they may lose control. The first of the duties imposed upon those who direct our affairs is to educate democracy, to reawaken, if possible, its religious beliefs, to purify its morals, to mold its actions, to substitute a knowledge of statecraft for its inexperience, and an awareness of its true interest for its blind instincts, to adapt its government to time and place, and to modify it according to men and to conditions. A new science of politics is needed for a new world.
This new science of politics is urgently required in view of a menace Tocqueville already sees as besetting democracy, the vast increase of state power in modern society. This is one of the great themes of democracy in America.
In the old regime, the power of a few of his subjects was an insurmountable barrier to the tyranny of the prince, and the monarch, who felt the almost divine character which he enjoyed in the eyes of the multitude, derived a motive for the just use of his power from the respect which he inspired. Custom and usage, moreover, had established certain limits to oppression. But today, it is the government alone that has inherited all the privileges of which families, guilds, and individuals have been deprived.
What is to be done about this vast increase in state power? Another great theme enters. Religion, Tocqueville asserts, is by its nature one of the chief allies of freedom. But because of historical accident, it has been unable to play its assigned role. In France, religion has opposed liberty.
Christianity, which has declared that all men are equal in the sight of God, will not refuse to acknowledge that all citizens are equal in the eyes of the law. But by a strange coincidence of events, religion has been for a time entangled with those institutions which democracy destroys. And it is not infrequently brought to reject the equality which it loves, and to curse as a foe that cause of liberty whose efforts it might hallow by its alliance.
By strange events that pitted religion against liberty, Tocqueville means the bonds between the church and absolute monarchy, the united front of throne and altar. But he suggests that the confusion about religion and freedom is linked to an even deeper malaise in contemporary society, that is, to a shattering of the foundations of all lawful order, of any concept of good and evil.
Has man always inhabited a world like the present, where all things are not in their proper relationships, where the love of order is confused with a taste for oppression, and the holy cult of freedom with a contempt of law, where the light thrown by conscience on human actions is dim, and where nothing seems to be any longer forbidden or allowed, honorable or shameful, false or true.
Quickly, Tocqueville's practical sense comes to the rescue, and he puts aside these dark thoughts.
I cannot believe that the Creator made man to leave him in an endless struggle with the intellectual wretchedness that surrounds us. God destines a calmer and more certain future to the communities of Europe.
Tocqueville presents himself as free of prejudice, either for or against democracy. Although it is doubtful that he actually succeeded in the virtually impossible task of shedding the values of his upbringing, Tocqueville always insisted on his impartiality. In 1837, he wrote to Henry Reeve, his English translator,
People ascribe to me alternately aristocratic and democratic prejudice. If I had been born in another period, or in another country, I might have had either one or the other, but my birth, as it happened, made it easy for me to guard against both. I came into the world at the end of a long revolution, which, after destroying ancient institutions, created none that could last. When I entered life, aristocracy was dead, and democracy was yet unborn. My instincts, therefore, could not lead me blindly to the one or the other.
Tocqueville believed that the political institutions of a people are produced by three great causes: their physical circumstances, their laws, and their mœurs. Mœurs can be translated as mores, and it suggests customs, values, a way of life. Of these three main factors, Tocqueville thought the last, mores, was the most important. This division into three factors determines the structure of Part 1 of Democracy in America. Tocqueville begins by discussing the exterior form of North America, that is, the physical circumstances. When European man came to the Caribbean and to South America, he found nature to be generous, a constant delight. By contrast, Middle America, or the United States, was a land made for work. It was sparsely inhabited by a poor and ignorant yet noble race given the name Indians. Their notions of the great intellectual truths, Tocqueville states, were, in general, simple and philosophical. European colonists would inevitably subdue this race and make this vast territory their own. As Tocqueville observes,
In that land, the great experiment of the attempt to construct society upon a new basis was to be made by civilized man. And it was there, for the first time, that theories, hitherto unknown or deemed impracticable, were to exhibit a spectacle for which the world had not been prepared by the history of the past.
Tocqueville's next chapter, entitled Origin of the Anglo-Americans, surveys the background of the laws and mores of the Americans. Tocqueville holds that just as childhood determines an adult's character and personality, so the first stages in the life of a people shape and mold their national character and their way of life. Tocqueville declares,
The readers of this book will find in the present chapter the germ of all that is to follow and the key to almost the whole work.
The Englishmen who colonized North America, Tocqueville points out, came from a country long agitated by struggles between liberty and power. They were, therefore, more conversant with the principles of true freedom than were the greater part of their European contemporaries. Democracy was an element in the American makeup from the very start. First, because those who colonized were not from the upper classes, but from segments of society looking to better their lot. Second, because an American aristocracy could not get a footing in the new country.
It was soon realized that in order to clear this land, nothing less than the constant and self-interested efforts of the owner himself was essential. Land is the basis of aristocracy, which clings to the soil that supports it. A nation may present immense fortunes and extreme wretchedness, but unless those fortunes are territorial, there is no true aristocracy, but simply the class of the rich and that of the poor.
But Tocqueville omits a very large part of America, namely the South. The reason? The South's peculiar institution, slavery.
This was the fact which was to exert an immense influence on the character, the laws, the whole future of the South. Slavery dishonors labor. It introduces idleness into society, and with idleness, ignorance and pride, luxury and distress. It dissipates the powers of the mind and benumbs the activity of man. The influence of slavery, united to the English character, explains the manners and the social condition of the southern states.
Thus, by America, Tocqueville means the northern free states, and above all, New England, to him the cradle of America. The first settlers of New England were the Puritans. Socially, they were more or less equal. Politically, they established institutions by which the adult male citizens exercised the rights of sovereignty, naming their own magistrates, and often directly conducting the business of government. They drew many of their principles of law, and often even the details of the law, from the religious faith that animated them. Tocqueville notes a salient element in the lawmaking of these Puritans.
The chief care was the maintenance of orderly conduct and good morals in the community. Thus, they constantly invaded the domain of conscience, and there was scarcely a sin which was not subject to magisterial censure. In some places, the legislator, entirely forgetting the great principles of religious toleration that he himself demanded in Europe, made attendance at divine service compulsory, and went so far as to visit with severe punishments, and even with death, Christians who chose to worship God according to a ritual differing from his own. It must not be forgotten that these fantastic and oppressive laws were not imposed by authority, but that they were freely voted by all the persons interested in them.
Tocqueville does not notice, however, an opposing strand in early New England society, the strand represented by Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, who insisted on freedom of choice in religion and personal morals. Neither Hutchinson nor Williams appears in Tocqueville's work. Instead, Tocqueville refers to the formation of the first public schools, whose aim was to instill the prevailing religious and moral doctrines. And he cites an address by John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Company. Previously, Tocqueville had referred to the fantastic and oppressive laws of the Puritans. Now he expresses his admiration for and agreement with Winthrop's defense of those laws. Here, Winthrop gives what Tocqueville calls a fine definition of liberty.
Concerning liberty, I observe a great mistake in the country about that. There is a twofold liberty: natural, I mean as our nature is now corrupt, and civil or federal. By natural liberty, man hath liberty to do what he lists. It is a liberty to evil as well as to good. This is that great enemy of truth and peace, that wild beast which all the ordinances of God are bent against, to restrain and subdue. The other kind of liberty I call civil or federal. It is a liberty to that only which is good, just, and honest. This liberty is maintained and exercised in a way of subjection to authority. It is of the same kind of liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free.
But besides religious faith, Tocqueville notes another element in the American makeup.
One sees the Americans seeking with almost equal eagerness material wealth and moral satisfaction, heaven in the world beyond, and well-being and liberty in this one.
This theme of the pursuit of wealth and the ways in which it combines and clashes with religious faith and the love of freedom appears throughout Democracy in America. This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette. Tocqueville now examines in more detail the third main factor which determines the political institutions of a people, namely the mores, or the social condition of the Americans. In words that echo Guizot, Tocqueville begins by sketching his theory of social causation.
Social condition is commonly the result of circumstances, sometimes of laws, oftener still of these causes united. But when once established, it may justly be considered as itself the source of almost all the laws, the usages, and the ideas which regulate the conduct of nations. Whatever it does not produce, it modifies.
The social condition of Americans, he observes, is eminently democratic. Even in the South, where a landed elite exists, there is no true aristocracy, since it possesses no distinctive legal privileges. The result is a constant circulation of property.
Wealth circulates with inconceivable rapidity, and experience shows that it is rare to find two succeeding generations in the full enjoyment of it. America, then, exhibits in this social state an extraordinary phenomenon. Men are there seen on a greater equality in point of fortune and intellect, or in other words, more equal in their strength, than in any other country of the world, or in any age of which history has preserved remembrance.
But Tocqueville perceives a grave danger, the possibility of despotism. First, despotism may be abetted by a perversion of the love of equality.
There is a manly and lawful passion for equality that incites men to wish all to be powerful and honored. But there exists also in the human heart a depraved taste for equality, which impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level, and reduces men to preferring equality and slavery to inequality with freedom.
Second, in a state of equality, it may be difficult to gather sufficient forces to resist encroaching despotism. Tocqueville was a lifelong student of the great 18th century political thinker, the Baron de Montesquieu. One of Montesquieu's chief concerns was how to avoid despotism. His masterpiece of political theory, The Spirit of the Laws, addresses this concern.
It is an eternal experience that every man who possesses power is led to abuse it. He proceeds until he finds limits, so that no one will abuse the power he has. It is necessary that, by the disposition of things, power checks power.
Tocqueville questions whether a democratic society lends itself to this kind of resistance.
In a state where the citizens are all practically equal, it becomes difficult for them to preserve their independence against the aggressions of power. No one among them being strong enough to engage in the struggle alone with advantage, nothing but a general combination can protect their liberty. Such a union is not always possible.
This issue would occupy Tocqueville in all of his work. Here he just suggests that through their circumstances, their intelligence, and especially their morals, Americans have been able to avoid the temptations of equality and servitude. Hindrances to popular sovereignty had existed in the early years of the American colonies, but with the cataclysm of the Revolution, together with changes in the laws of inheritance, the democratic principle won out. Power passed from the various elites to the people at large. Tocqueville quite deliberately begins his discussion of popular government in the United States at the basic level, that of the township. This, he believes, forms the foundation of American democracy. In the township system, the people learn self-government by practicing it. They either directly administer the various affairs of the community, such as education, roads, and other public works, or they elect and oversee those who do. Democracy at the local level is an indispensable condition for democracy at the state and national levels. Tocqueville links local self-government with the question of limiting the power of the central state. Note that he uses the word society rather than state.
There are two methods of diminishing the force of authority in a nation. The first is to weaken the supreme power in its very principle, by forbidding or preventing society from acting in its own defense under certain circumstances. This manner is the European way. The second manner does not consist of stripping society of some of its rights, but in distributing the exercise of its powers among various hands and in multiplying functionaries, to each of whom is given the degree of power necessary to perform his duty. It was never assumed in the United States that the citizen in a free country has a right to do whatever he pleases. On the contrary, more social obligations were there imposed upon him than anywhere else. No idea was ever entertained of attacking the principle or contesting the rights of society. But the exercise of its authority was divided, in order that the office might be powerful and the officer insignificant, and that the community should be at once regulated and free.
Tocqueville appears to be saying that while friends of freedom in Europe sought to limit the extent of state power, in America they sought simply to distribute state power as widely as possible. If this is his meaning, he is surely mistaken. In America, the Jeffersonian tradition always insisted that the powers of government must be few and severely limited. The Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution, for example, represented constraints on political power over the individual citizen. As some commentators have complained, from time to time Tocqueville seems to force the facts to fit his own notions of political philosophy. Now, Tocqueville comes to a problem that will occupy him for the rest of his life: centralization of state power. He begins with a distinction.
There exist two distinct kinds of centralization. Certain interests are common to all parts of a nation, such as the enactment of its general laws and the maintenance of its foreign relations. Other interests are peculiar to certain parts of a nation. When the power that directs the former or general interest is concentrated in one place or in the same persons, it constitutes a centralized government. To concentrate in like manner in one place the direction of the latter or local interest constitutes what may be termed a centralized administration.
Centralized government, he believes, benefits society. Indeed, the lack of such centralization produced the chaos of feudalism. Centralized administration, however, the direction of all the affairs of society by a monolithic state bureaucracy, is viewed by Tocqueville as the great modern evil.
Although such an administration can bring together, at a given moment, on a given point, all the disposable resources of a people, it injures the renewal of those resources. It may ensure a victory in the hour of strife, but it gradually relaxes the sinews of strength. It may help admirably the transient greatness of a man, but not the durable prosperity of a nation.
Here is another of Tocqueville's constant motifs: the varying effects on human character of different social and political arrangements. We should not look, he thinks, simply at the immediate effects of a policy. Instead, we should ask ourselves, how will this policy shape and condition the character of the people? Tocqueville considers centralization to be so destructive to the independent and resourceful human type that he piles argument on argument against centralization. One argument is reminiscent of the economic case against government economic planning.
However enlightened and skillful a central power may be, it cannot of itself embrace all the details of the life of a great nation. Such vigilance exceeds the powers of man.
While centralization generates uniformity, which in turn frustrates innovation and progress, the American system draws on the creative spirit of the people.
In no other country in the world do the citizens make such exertions for the commonweal. I know of no people who have established schools so numerous and efficacious, places of public worship better suited to the wants of the inhabitants, or roads kept in better repair. Uniformity or permanence of design, the minute arrangements of details, and the perfection of administrative system must not be sought for in the United States. What we find there is the presence of a power which, if it is somewhat wild, is at least robust, and an existence checkered with accidents indeed, but full of animation and effort.
Tocqueville contrasts America to places where total centralization prevails. He is probably thinking of areas such as the Turkish Empire and Russia.
There are countries in Europe where the native considers himself as a kind of settler, indifferent to the fate of the spot which he inhabits. The greatest changes are effected there without his concurrence and without his knowledge. Nay more, the condition of his village, the policing of his street, the repairs of his church or the parsonage do not concern him, for he looks upon all these things as unconnected with himself and as the property of a powerful stranger whom he calls the government. When a nation has arrived at this state, it must either change its customs and its laws or perish, for the source of public virtues is dried up, and though it may contain subjects, it has no citizens.
Ever anxious, lest despair stifle the quest for improvement, Tocqueville ends this chain of thought on a note of hope.
It depends upon the laws to awaken and direct the vague impulse of patriotism, which never abandons the human heart. Let it not be said that it is too late to make the experiment, for nations do not grow old as men do, and every fresh generation is a new people ready for the care of the legislator.
The legislator. Tocqueville was a lifelong student of the political theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Besides this echo from Rousseau's social contract, referring to the redemptive role of the lawgiver, there are other traces of Rousseau's influence. In Tocqueville's concern with public spiritedness and the willingness to sacrifice for the common good, and in his high valuation of civic participation as a way of lending dignity to the individual's life. That a liberal such as Tocqueville should incorporate Rousseauian ideas in his philosophy may seem odd, but as Tocqueville admitted, he was a liberal of a new sort. Tocqueville next examines the Constitution of the United States. Many European liberals were impressed, even amazed, by this document. William Gladstone, the liberal Prime Minister of Great Britain in the latter 19th century, called the Constitution the most brilliant work ever struck off at one time by the pen of man. This last phrase was added to distinguish the Constitution from the Bible. Tocqueville is similarly impressed.
The assembly which accepted the task of composing the Constitution was small, but George Washington was its president, and it contains the finest minds and the noblest characters that had ever appeared in the New World.
Tocqueville sketches, for the benefit of his European readers, the various organs and functions of the federal government. The balance of power, he thinks, lies with the states rather than the federal government. It is the states that have the people's deepest loyalties. This is why Tocqueville has doubts on the ability of the Union to survive. Why did he overlook the possibility that over time power would pass from the states to the central government? Tocqueville may have been misled by one of the fathers of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton. Tocqueville was a diligent student of the Federalist Papers. In that work, Hamilton, anxious to downplay the centralizing features of the new Constitution, claimed that power will tend to drift toward the states.
Upon the same principle that a man is more attached to his family than to his neighborhood than to the community at large, the people of each state would be apt to feel a stronger bias toward their local government than towards the government of the Union. This strong propensity of the human heart would find powerful auxiliaries in the objects of state regulation. It will always be far more easy for the state governments to encroach upon the national authorities than for the national authorities to encroach upon the state authorities.
Tocqueville also mistakenly minimized the role of the president within the federal government. His views on the American presidency were strongly affected by his meeting with President Andrew Jackson. Tocqueville and Beaumont were not overwhelmed. Beaumont wrote home,
"He is an old man of 66 years, well preserved, and appears to have retained all the vigor of his body and spirit. He is not a man of genius. His great merit is to have won the Battle of New Orleans against the English. That victory made him popular, and brought it about that he was elected president. So true is it that in every country military glory has a prestige that the masses can't resist, even when the masses are composed of merchants and businessmen. The President of the United States occupies a palace that in Paris would be called a fine private residence. He has no guards watching at the door, and if he has courtiers, they are not very attentive to him, for when he entered the salon, he was alone. We chatted of things that were insignificant enough. He made us drink a glass of Madeira wine, and we thanked him, using the word monsieur."
But Tocqueville saw the potential for power in the office of the presidency.
It is chiefly in its foreign relations that the executive power of a nation finds occasion to exert its skill and its strength. If the existence of the United States were perpetually threatened, if its chief interests were in daily connection with those of other powerful nations, the executive government would assume an increased importance in proportion to the measures expected of it and to those which it would execute. The President of the United States possesses almost royal prerogatives, which he has no opportunity of exercising. The laws allow him to be strong, but circumstances keep him weak.
Now, Tocqueville goes beyond the skeleton of the political constitution to more fundamental factors.
Thus far, I have examined the institutions of the United States, but above these institutions, and beyond all these characteristic forms, there is a sovereign power, that of the people, which may destroy or modify them at its pleasure. It remains to be shown in what manner this power, superior to the laws, acts. What are its instincts and passions? What the secret springs that retard, accelerate, or direct its irresistible course? What the effects of its unbounded authority? And what the destiny that is reserved for it?
Tocqueville pursues these questions throughout the rest of Democracy in America. After discussing political parties, which he considers a necessary evil, Tocqueville turns to freedom of the press. Tocqueville senses a paradox in America. Despite the total freedom of the press, the result is not disorder and turmoil. It is the reverse.
America is perhaps, at this moment, the country of the whole world that contains the fewest germs of revolution. the general principles of the government are more stable, and the chief opinions which regulate society are more durable there. I attribute this to a cause that may, at first sight, appear to have an opposite tendency, namely, to the liberty of the press.
Tocqueville now veers into one of those bypaths that occur from time to time in democracy in America. These digressions have fascinated his students. After all, any political theory, a theory of how human beings should or do interact, involves a theory of human nature, a theory of what man is. In examining human nature, Tocqueville sketches the psychological stages of belief in man. He begins with the stage of uncritical faith.
A man believes firmly because he has adopted a proposition without inquiry. He doubts as soon as objections present themselves, but he frequently succeeds in satisfying these doubts, and then he begins again to believe. This time he has not a dim and casual glimpse of the truth, but sees it clearly before him and advances by the light it gives.
So far, this seems optimistic and consistent with the view of 18th and 19th century classical liberals on man's progress toward greater rationality. But immediately, a darker tone is introduced.
It may be doubted, however, whether this rational and self-guiding conviction arouses as much fervor or enthusiastic devotion in men as does their first dogmatical belief.
Tocqueville concludes on a strangely somber note.
We may rest assured that the majority of mankind will always remain in one of these two states, will either believe they know not wherefore, or will not know what to believe. Few are those who can ever attain to that other state of rational and independent conviction which true knowledge can produce out of the midst of doubt.
Returning from this digression on human psychology as conditioned by history, Tocqueville notes the pervasive presence of associations in America.
In no country in the world has the principle of association been more successfully used or applied to a greater multitude of objects than in America. Besides the permanent associations, which are established by law, a vast number of others are formed and maintained by private individuals. The citizen of the United States is taught from infancy to rely upon his own exertions in order to resist the evils and the difficulties of life. He looks upon the social authority with an eye of mistrust and anxiety.
In the United States, the voluntary sector of society flourishes, and political life is often avoided. Tocqueville is surprised by how much talent there is among the citizens, and how little among the leaders of government. A democracy will rarely have strong leaders, leaders willing to stand up to the majority. The people are surrounded by flatterers. There is no elite, more foresighted than the multitude, whose guidance and chastisements they accept. Like children, the people will resent any sacrifice, preferring instead to indulge their momentary desires. This, Tocqueville comments, creates problems for foreign relations. For example, regarding conscription.
In America, conscription is unknown, and men are induced to enlist by bounties. The notions and habits of the people of the United States are so opposed to compulsory recruitment that I do not think it can ever be sanctioned by the laws.
The people, Tocqueville maintains, are accustomed to pursuing their own affairs and to accumulating wealth. The glory of war means little to them. They will chafe at burdens such as conscription. But such burdens are inevitable in any confrontation with another power. So far, America has avoided the sacrifices of war by following a very different foreign policy from the European powers. This policy is non-intervention, or isolationism, as it is sometimes labeled. Tocqueville cites Washington's farewell address to illustrate this principle. Washington declared,
The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible.
Non-intervention and the geographical circumstances of the country permitted Americans to enjoy peace for virtually the whole half-century of their history up to the time of Tocqueville's visit. It remained to be seen whether they could continue to do so. Throughout Tocqueville's great work, democracy is never a black or white proposition. It has drawbacks, it has advantages. Both are connected with the new kind of social order still in the process of being born. This is a crucial aspect of Tocqueville's thought. One reason he is considered among the foremost modern sociologists is that he recognized and built on the concept of a great transition between the fading world of the past and the new world being created before Tocqueville's very eyes. It is analogous to the stages of belief Tocqueville described, and can be further illustrated by a transformation in the feeling of patriotism. According to Tocqueville, there is an older kind of patriotism now passing away.
It connects the affections of man with his birthplace. This natural fondness is united with a taste for ancient customs and a reverence for traditions of the past. Those who cherish it love their country as they love the house of their father. It is, in itself, a kind of religion. It does not reason, but it acts from impulse of faith and sentiment.
A new spirit of patriotism is more consistent with the spirit of modern times.
There is another species of attachment to country which is more rational than the one I've been describing. It is perhaps less generous and less ardent, but it is more fruitful and more lasting. A man comprehends the influence which the well-being of his country has on his own. He is aware that the laws permit him to contribute to that prosperity, and he labors to promote it, first because it benefits him, and secondly because it is, in part, his own work.
Tocqueville believes the old traditional world is lost forever. The worm of skepticism and doubt has subverted all ancient loyalties. The burning question now is, how are men to be led to care about the fate of their fellow men and their country? Tocqueville utters a cry from the heart.
Do you not see that religious belief is shaken, and the divine notion of right is declining, that morality is debased, and the notion of moral right is therefore fading away? Argument is substituted for faith, and calculation for the pulse of sentiment. If, in the midst of this general disruption, you do not succeed in connecting the notion of right with that of private interest, which is the only immutable point in the human heart, what means will you have of governing the world except fear?
Nevertheless, the democratic approach to patriotism still offers a hope.
The most powerful, and perhaps the only means that we still possess of interesting men in the welfare of their country, is to make them partners in the government. The lower orders in the United States understand the influence exercised by the general prosperity on their own welfare. The citizen looks upon the fortune of the public as his own, and he labors for the good of the state not merely from a sense of pride or duty, but from what I venture to term cupidity.
Here, Tocqueville combines two different motives that could substitute for the fading old type of patriotism. The first motive is participation in the governing process through institutions of democratic government. The second is the recognition that an individual's well-being stands or falls with that of his society. Both are democratic motives in a sense. Both pertain to the New World, which dislodges status, hierarchy, tradition, and sacrifice, to put in their place a deification of the individual and his personal concerns. To make sense of the enormously complex phenomena of social evolution, Tocqueville resorts to what he calls imaginary states. Later, the term ideal types will be used for this approach. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville's major imaginary states, or ideal types, are aristocracy and democracy. These do not stand merely for contrasting legal systems or social structures. Each entails contrasting value systems, ways of life, feelings, and what Tocqueville calls habits of the heart. Viewed in this way, aristocratic man and democratic man become two distinct types of human being. In comparing them, Tocqueville, the product of 25 generations of Norman nobility, asks these questions.
Do you wish to give a certain elevation to the human mind and teach it to regard the things of this world with generous feelings, to inspire men with a scorn of mere temporal advantages, to form and nourish strong convictions and keep alive the spirit of honorable devotedness? Is it your object to refine the habits, embellish the manners, and cultivate the arts, to promote the love of poetry, beauty, and glory? Would you constitute a people fitted to act powerfully upon all other nations, and prepared for those high enterprises which, whatever be their results, will leave a name forever famous in history?
If this is your aim, then avoid democracy, Tocqueville advises, for these are the characteristics of aristocratic society. But Tocqueville lives in the time of transition, and he divines what democracy is bringing in its train.
But if you hold it expedient to divert the moral and intellectual activity of man to the production of comfort and the promotion of general well-being, if a clear understanding be more profitable to man than genius, if your object is not to stimulate the virtues of heroism, but the habits of peace, if, instead of living in the midst of a brilliant society, you are contented to have prosperity around you, if, in short, you are of the opinion that the principal object of government is not to confer the greatest power and glory upon the body of the nation, but to ensure the greatest enjoyment and to avoid the most misery to each of the individuals who compose it, if such be your desire, then equalize the conditions of man and establish democratic institutions.
For rhetorical effect, Tocqueville presents the two ideal types as real alternatives. But in fact, he holds that democracy is inevitable. He contends, however, that the majority does not have the right to do whatever it wishes.
I hold it to be an impious and detestable maxim that, politically speaking, the people have a right to do anything. A general law, which bears the name of justice, has been made and sanctioned not only by a majority of this or that people, but by a majority of mankind. The rights of every people are therefore confined within the limits of what is just. When I refuse to obey an unjust law, I do not contest the right of the majority to command, but I simply appeal from the sovereignty of the people to the sovereignty of mankind.
Tocqueville gives no example of an act which all mankind considers unjust when committed by a majority against an individual. He wishes to preserve some sphere of freedom for the individual, yet perhaps because of his admitted distaste for philosophical speculation, he does not suggest any theory of individual rights. At this point, Tocqueville focuses on the threat to freedom in democratic society, a threat that comes from the people itself. The great danger is the tyranny of the majority, a phrase that helped make Part 1 of Democracy in America famous, and left a deep impression on John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. In modern society, Tocqueville claims, the individual is threatened not by the monarch and his agents, or even by the power of government. The real threat comes from the massed power of all of society, from the totality of governmental and non-governmental institutions. Indeed, the pressures of non-governmental forces can often be stronger and harder to resist than the state power itself. Tocqueville discovered this during his trip. In Baltimore, for instance, he conversed with Richard Stewart, a distinguished physician, and learned about the potency of public opinion. Dr. Stewart explained how it enforces conformity to religious beliefs.
Public opinion does with us what the Inquisition could never do. I have known a lot of young people who thought they had discovered that the Christian religion was not true. Carried away by the ardor of youth, they have started loudly proclaiming this opinion. What then? Some have been forced to leave the country, or to vegetate miserably there. Others have been constrained to an external religious conformity, or have at least kept quiet. The number who have thus been suppressed by public opinion is very considerable.
Tocqueville ponders this dark side of democracy. Since the essence of democratic government consists in the sovereignty of the majority, all legal and political institutions will tend to fall under the majority's sway. Moreover, in a democracy, the will of the people exerts a potent, if often subtle, control over the would-be dissident, even in the deepest recesses of his mind. Such a situation fills Tocqueville with anxiety, since it presages the end of intellectual freedom, the end of cultural progress, and even the end of individual independence. Fortunately, certain forces tend to limit the tyranny of the majority. Tocqueville discusses, for instance, the legal profession, trained to respect precedent and order, which naturally acts to prevent democratic excess. The force on which Tocqueville focuses, however, is religion. Religion engaged Tocqueville's thinking all of his life. His personal views have been a matter of controversy. Some claim he was a devout Christian, even a Catholic. It is true that Tocqueville participated in Catholic worship, but this appears to have been more from his obligations as a nobleman and a landowner than from sincere faith. Tocqueville wrote to a young friend,
I am not a believer, which I am far from saying in order to boast, but as much of an unbeliever as I may be, I have never been able to keep from feeling a profound emotion in reading the Gospel.
It seems most likely that Tocqueville was a deist, that is, he believed in God, in a God-given moral code, and in an afterlife, but not in the doctrines of any particular faith. What concerned him most was the functional value of religion. As he states in Democracy in America,
if it be of the highest importance to man as an individual that his religion should be true, it is not so to society. Society has no future life to hope for or to fear, and provided the citizens profess a religion, the particular tenets of that religion are of little importance to its interests.
Throughout Democracy in America, Tocqueville accentuates the value of religion. In doing so, he argues against an anti-religious tradition still strong among French liberals, dating from the period of the 18th century Enlightenment. Following the French Revolution, however, the liberal hostility toward religion began to give way. The outstanding liberal of the time, Benjamin Constant, condemned religious intolerance, but respected faith in a supreme being, and felt it had a critical role to play in guaranteeing freedom. His close friend, Madame de Staël, agreed.
Since the revolution was made in the name of philosophy, the conclusion has been drawn that one has to be an atheist in order to love freedom. But it was precisely because the French did not unite religion with freedom that the revolution deviated so quickly from its early course. It is Christianity that truly has brought freedom upon this earth, justice to the oppressed, respect for the unfortunate, and above all, equality before God. of which equality before the law is only an imperfect image.
Tocqueville shared this attitude, and his experiences in America confirmed him in his convictions. Throughout his stay, he was struck again and again by the religiosity of the people. Tocqueville observed that the clergy kept its distance from political affairs and partisan politics. Religious influence is more indirect and more powerful than politics. Religion determines the customs, the basic way of life of the people. In turn, this acts on political life. One of the greatest channels of religious influence is through the institution of marriage and the family. Americans are extraordinarily devoted to the family, Tocqueville remarks. He implies that the easy French acceptance of a mistress or a lover would not be countenanced in America. Tocqueville notes another effect of the deep-seated religious faith of the Americans, that is, fixity in matters of doctrine and morals. This is a necessary complement to the thrust toward innovation, which is characteristic of a democracy. Moreover, Christian morality acts as an obstacle to injustice against the individual.
While the law permits the Americans to do what they please, religion prevents them from conceiving, and forbids them to commit, what is rash or unjust.
As for the theory that religion dies out as freedom and enlightenment advance, America disproves it. The reason? Religious belief is inherent in human nature. To Tocqueville, lack of faith is a moral abnormality. The French anti-religious writers made a grave mistake. They considered a temporary and accidental condition in France, the united front of religious authority with reactionary political powers, to be necessary and permanent. Tocqueville observes,
The unbelievers of Europe attack the Christians as their political opponents rather than as their religious adversaries. They hate the Christian religion as the opinion of a party much more than as an error of belief. And they reject the clergy less because they are representatives of the deity than because they are allies of government.
the democratic current sweeping the Western world makes religious belief more important than ever.
Despotism may govern without faith, but liberty cannot. Religion is much more necessary in a republic than in a monarchy. How is it possible that society should escape destruction if the moral tie is not strengthened in proportion as the political tie is relaxed? And what can be done with a people who are their masters if they are not subject to a deity?
The answer for France and Europe, then, is to sever the bonds between the Christian churches and the last-ditch supporters of the old regime, whose cause, in any case, is doomed. In that way, faith can flourish again and act as a bulwark of a free society, as it does in America. Europe is to learn from America, just as America, centuries before, had sprung from European roots. There was, however, one lesson that America needed to learn for herself, the lesson of slavery. It is to this peculiar institution that Tocqueville now turns his attention. This is the end of Tape 1 on Democracy in America. The presentation is continued on Tape 2. This is the second of two tapes on Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville admired much in the American character. In a long letter home to France, he declared,
"In America, each man has a sense of his independent position and his individual dignity that does not always make his bearing very agreeable, but which definitely leads him to respect himself and to respect others.
Harriet Martineau, an Englishwoman who toured America at the same time as Tocqueville, also admired the American character. Like her French counterpart, she lamented its tragic flaw, slavery. In her autobiography, she wrote,
"A rigid censorship in the southern states expunged from English and other classics every reference to slavery and every perilous aspiration after freedom. Abolitionists were kept out by the most vigilant cruelty, which inflicted torture on mere suspicion. Free Negroes were lodged in prison, even when they were British sailors. The right of petition to Congress was temporarily abolished. Every liberty, personal and social, was sacrificed in the attempt to enforce silence on that one sore subject. And now the whole world rings with it."
The last section of Part 1 of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the part that appeared in 1835, is dominated by a chapter entitled The Present and Probable Future Condition of the Three Races that Inhabit the Territory of the United States. The American situation in regard to race must have seemed unprecedented to a Frenchman like Tocqueville. Here was a land that was the home of three distinct races: the Indians, or Native Americans, the Negroes, and the whites. This created unparalleled problems. Would Americans be able to solve them? Tocqueville strongly opposed race hatred and racial discrimination. Nothing in America distressed him so much as its subjugation of Indians and blacks. He writes,
"If we reason from what passes in the world, we should almost say that the European is to the other races of mankind what man himself is to the lower animals. He makes them subservient to his use, and when he cannot subdue them, he destroys them."
The Indians were forced to retreat before the advancing Europeans. Tocqueville compares the ethos of the Indians, their system of values, to that of the feudal lords in the Middle Ages. War and hunting were viewed as the only worthwhile occupations. But some of them, Tocqueville notes, proved their capacity for what is called civilization. He mentions the Cherokees, who not only invented a written language, but even set up a newspaper. But assimilating the ways of the white man did not save them. By a remarkable coincidence, Tocqueville personally witnessed one of the worst episodes in the destruction of the Indian world. In December 1831, he and Beaumont were at Memphis, Tennessee, anxiously seeking transportation down the Mississippi to New Orleans. Finally, a steamboat appeared. Tocqueville was negotiating with the captain when a great troop of Indians emerged from the forest, young men and women, children, old people. They were Choctaws, and this was the Trail of Tears. Along with the Choctaws, the Cherokees, the Creeks, and the other so-called civilized tribes had been forced from their lands in Georgia and Alabama, a result of the policy of Indian removal, executed under the seal of President Andrew Jackson. The Indians were removed despite a Supreme Court decision by John Marshall prohibiting such action. As Jackson commented, "That's Marshall's decision. Let him enforce it." An estimated 125,000 Indians were transported to reservations during Jackson's administration. Thousands died as a result of the forced march. In a message to Congress, Jackson proclaimed,
"Humanity has often wept over the fate of the aborigines of this country, and philanthropy has been long busily employed in devising means to avert it. But its progress has never for a moment been arrested, and one by one have many powerful tribes disappeared from the earth."
In a letter dated Christmas Day, Tocqueville wrote to his mother of how the Americans approached the Indian question.
Rational and unprejudiced people, moreover great philanthropists, they supposed, like the Spanish, that God had given them the New World and its inhabitants as complete property. The Spanish, truly brutal, loose their dogs on the Indians as on ferocious beasts. They kill, burn, massacre, pillage the New World as one would take a city by assault, without pity as without discrimination. But one cannot destroy everything. Fury has a limit. The rest of the Indian population ultimately becomes mixed with its conquerors, takes on their mores, their religion. The Americans of the United States, more humane, more moderate, more respectful of law and legality, never bloodthirsty, are profoundly more destructive. The poor Indians take their old parents in their arms. The women load their children on their shoulders. The nation finally puts itself on the march. It abandons forever the soil on which, perhaps for 1,000 years, its fathers have lived, in order to go settle in a wilderness where the whites will not leave them 10 years in peace.
Tocqueville observed the masses of Choctaw, freezing, sick, some dying, board the steamboat. He was profoundly moved.
There was an air of ruin and destruction, something that savored of a farewell that was final and with no return. The Indians were calm, but somber and taciturn. We will deposit them tomorrow in the solitudes of Arkansas. This is a singular accident that made us come to Memphis to witness the expulsion, one might say the dissolution, of one of the most celebrated and most ancient American nations. But enough of the savages. It is time to return to civilized people.
This episode colors Tocqueville's whole discussion of the fate of the Native Americans. Tocqueville mentions that Indian leaders arise from time to time who try to unite all the nations against the European invaders, to no avail. It was their misfortune, Tocqueville says, to confront a civilized people who are also the most grasping nation on the globe. He concludes,
I believe that the Indian nations of North America are doomed to perish, and that whenever the European shall be established on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, that race of men will have ceased to exist.
But according to Tocqueville, the most formidable danger threatening America is the problem of the blacks. Slavery has degraded the Negro.
Having been told from infancy that his race is naturally inferior to that of the whites, he assents to the proposition and is ashamed of his own nature. In each of his features he discovers a trace of slavery, and if it were in his power, he would willingly rid himself of everything that makes him what he is.
Even after it is removed, slavery leaves prejudice behind it. Free blacks in the North suffer from the disdain of whites no less than those enslaved in the South. Tocqueville gathered his views on slavery and the South from many sources. One of them was the former president, John Quincy Adams. At a dinner party in Boston, Tocqueville sat next to Adams, who did not hesitate to state his strong opinions.
In slavery are to be found almost all the embarrassments of the present and fears of the future. Slavery has modified the whole state of society in the South. Every white man in the South is a being equally privileged, whose destiny is to make the Negroes work without working himself. We cannot conceive how far the idea that work is dishonorable has entered the spirit of the Americans of the South. From this laziness, in which the Southern whites live, great differences in character result. They devote themselves to bodily exercise, to hunting, to racing. They are vigorously constituted, brave, full of honor. What is called the point of honor is more delicate there than anywhere else. Duels are frequent.
According to Adams, the South produced an aristocratic personality, but Tocqueville felt no admiration for these simulations of the European nobility. Slavery was a blight, not only on those held in bondage, but on the rest of society. In Democracy in America, he makes his point graphically.
The stream that the Indians name Ohio or the beautiful river, waters one of the most magnificent of valleys. The state which follows the numerous windings of the Ohio upon the left is called Kentucky. That upon the right bears the name of the river. These two states differ in only a single respect. Kentucky has admitted slavery, but the state of Ohio has prohibited it. Upon the left bank the population is sparse. From time to time one descries a troop of slaves loitering in the half-desert fields. The primeval forest reappears at every turn. Society seems to be asleep, man to be idle. From the right bank, on the contrary, a confused hum is heard which proclaims the presence of labor. The fields are covered with abundant harvest, and man appears to be in the enjoyment of that wealth and contentment which is the reward of labor.
Tocqueville claimed that the economic stagnation caused by slavery hurts everyone. A free society is vastly more productive than a slave society. Such a pragmatic and utilitarian argument is characteristic of Tocqueville on this issue. Tocqueville was an unequivocal abolitionist, and as a member of the French Chamber of Deputies, he worked for the abolition of slavery in France's West Indian colonies. He insisted that slavery was immoral, but he was also well aware that early attempts to do away with it in the French colonies had relied exclusively on the moral argument and had foundered. The English anti-slavery movement, on the other hand, had used both sorts of arguments and had been victorious. Concerned as he was, not simply to make a rhetorical point, but to ensure that slavery was wiped out, Tocqueville exploited the sort of pragmatic appeal that would achieve that end. Tocqueville was pessimistic on the future of race relations in America. He felt that the Negroes and the whites must either wholly part or wholly mingle. There seemed no possibility of a biracial society where both races were equal. What would be the outcome? Would the Union endure? Tocqueville was of two minds. In his notes, he called the dissolution of the Union something certain in time. But this prediction does not appear in Democracy in America, where he speaks of forces pulling in both directions. Much later, in 1856, as the issue of slavery became more acute, Tocqueville wrote to the English economist Nassau Sr.,
I cannot desire, as many persons do, the dismemberment of America. Such an event would inflict a great wound on the whole human race, for it would introduce war into a great continent from whence it has been banished for more than a century. The breaking up of the American Union will be a solemn moment in the history of the world. I never met an American who did not feel this, and I believe that it will not be rashly or easily undertaken. There will, before actual rupture, be always a last interval in which one or both parties will draw back.
But Tocqueville was certain that either way, the Anglo-Americans would retain their Republican institutions. Some kind of extraordinary destiny awaited this new people. The 2 volumes of Democracy in America that appeared in 1835 end with his astonishing and celebrated prophecy.
There are at the present time 2 great nations in the world, which started from different points but seem to tend toward the same end, the Russians and the Americans. Both of them have grown up unnoticed. All the other nations have stopped or continue to advance with extreme difficulty. These alone are proceeding with ease and celerity along a path to which no limit can be perceived. The American struggles against nature. The adversaries of the Russian are men. The conquests of the American are therefore gained by the plowshare, those of the Russian by the sword. The Anglo-American relies upon personal interest to accomplish his ends, and gives free scope to the people. The Russian centers all the authority of society in a single arm. The principal instrument of the former is freedom, of the latter, servitude. Their starting point is different, and their courses are not the same, yet each of them seems marked out by the will of heaven to sway the destinies of half the globe.
The first part of Democracy in America was hailed as an instant classic of political thought. In France, in England, and in the United States itself, Tocqueville was praised as a modern master of the science. He was bemused. To a friend he wrote,
I feel like a certain lady of the court of Napoleon, whom the emperor once took it into his head to make a duchess. That evening, as she heard herself announced by her new title when she arrived at court, she forgot to whom it belonged, and she ranged herself to one side to let pass the noble lady whose name had just been called. I assure you, this is exactly my case. I ask myself if it be I that they are talking about. I infer that the world must consist of a poor set of people, since a book of my making, the limitations of which I know so well, has had the effect this appears to produce.
One reviewer, who devoted a long essay to the book, was John Stuart Mill.
Democracy in America has at once taken its rank among the most remarkable productions of our time. It is a book with which, both for its facts and its speculations, all who would understand, or who are called upon to exercise influence over their age, are bound to be familiar. It will contribute to the political speculations of our time a new character. Monsieur de Tocqueville has set the example of analyzing democracy. The author's mind, except that it is of a soberer character, seems to us to resemble Montesquieu most among the great French writers. The book is such as Montesquieu might have written, if to his genius he had superadded good sense, and the lights which mankind have since gained from the experiences of a period in which they may be said to have lived centuries in 50 years.
Mill's review was not simply effusive. It was a detailed analysis and discussion of the important issues raised by democracy in America. Tocqueville was grateful for Mill's insightfulness.
Of all my reviewers, you are perhaps the only one who has thoroughly understood me, who has taken a general bird's-eye view of my ideas, who sees their ulterior aim, and yet has preserved a clear perception of the details. I wanted this testimony to console me for all the false conclusions that are drawn from my book. I am constantly meeting people who want to persuade me of opinions that I proclaim, or who pretend to share with me opinions that I do not hold.
Tocqueville went to visit England, where he was lionized and befriended on all sides. The cream of British intellectual society, especially liberal society, rushed to congratulate him. Harriet Grote was the wife of a leading liberal, George Grote, an intellectual luminary in her own right. She described Tocqueville.
He is a small and delicate-looking young man, and a most engaging person, full of intelligence and knowledge, free from boasting and self-sufficiency, of gentle manners and handsome countenance. In conversing, he displays a candid and unprejudiced mind. About 32 years of age, of a noble race in Normandy, and unmarried.
This last omission Tocqueville soon made good. Several years before, he had made the acquaintance of an Englishwoman a few years older than himself, Mary Motley, a commoner and not particularly affluent. Tocqueville's family and many of his friends disapproved of their plan to marry. Finally, literary success assured, Tocqueville defied his family and made Mary his wife. Their union proved a generally happy one, though clouded by their having no children. But Tocqueville still had to complete his great work, Democracy in America, he still had to produce Part 2. This was proving difficult, though not from lack of inspiration. He wrote to Henry Reeve,
I have never worked on anything with as much enthusiasm. I think of my subject night and day. I would never have imagined that a subject that I have already revolved in my head so many ways could present itself to me with so many new faces.
5 years would elapse between the appearance of the 2 parts of Democracy in America. Part 2, in 2 volumes, would be published in 1840. In those 5 years, Tocqueville read widely and deeply in many fields, above all, the history of political thought. He had his favorites. He once wrote that there were 3 men he lived with every day: Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Pascal. Finally, Part 2 appeared. A guide to the work can be found in a note Tocqueville wrote to himself during its composition.
Point out, to myself as well, that I was led in the second work to take up once again some of the subjects already touched on in the first, or to modify some opinions expressed therein, necessary result of such a large work done in 2 stages. The first book more American than democratic, this one more democratic than American.
Part 2 deals with many of the same ideas and themes found in Part 1, but the treatment is more general, more abstract. Developments in Europe are drawn in more and more. The author tries harder to peer into the future, to discern dangers and cause for hope. And throughout, the emphasis is on the kind of human being democracy tends to produce. In Part 1, Tocqueville concentrated on the political institutions of democratic society. In Part 2, his field is as wide as the culture itself. He ranges from science and literature to domestic life and personal demeanor. Americans, he finds, have a strong preference for practical rather than theoretical ideas and sciences. This is altogether natural, given the never-ending bustle of a society in which everyone feels he can get ahead. Even literature becomes a trade, and there is little aristocratic fastidiousness of taste. In one major area of life, however, democracy has brought about a vast improvement. That area is the family. In aristocratic societies, children tend to view their parents, especially the father, with awe, even with fear. Their conduct is based on a rigid formalism and a readiness to obey. The firstborn son has pride of place, since he will usually inherit everything and fill his father's position as custodian of the family name and traditions. As the democratic mentality penetrates into the family, however, stiff formalism is replaced by the bonds of natural affection. And, since the firstborn son no longer has a privileged position, jealousy and rancor among the children give way to love. Social historians have called this model the bourgeois or middle-class family, built on the natural ties of love and commitment. Tocqueville, raised in an aristocratic environment, found it totally appealing. In his discussion of the family, there is none of Tocqueville's habitual ambivalence, his customary balancing of gains against losses.
Such is the charm of these democratic manners that even the partisans of aristocracy are attracted to it, and, after having experienced it for some time, they are by no means tempted to revert to the respectful and frigid observances of aristocratic families.
But Tocqueville's ultimate purpose is not simply to analyze the mores of a democratic society. His design is to show how they bear upon the great political issue of the coming age, the menace of despotism. The way is paved for despotism by a new and peculiar feeling which gains ground in a democratic society. That feeling is individualism. Today, the term individualism generally has favorable overtones, especially in the United States. But when it was coined in France in the early 19th century, it was used pejoratively. It suggested an exclusive concentration on one's personal affairs to the exclusion of the good of society. Tocqueville's usage derives from this 19th century meaning. In Part 1, Tocqueville referred to individualism as the rust of society. It was a problem that continued to engage him. In the summer of 1838, he was at the family's old castle in Normandy, pondering the sequel to the first part of Democracy in America. He also pondered the character of the local people. He wrote to his friend and mentor, Royer Collard,
I am attached to this population, without all the same concealing its faults, which are great. These people here are honest, intelligent, religious enough, passably moral, very steady, but they have scarcely any disinterestedness. It is true that egoism in this region does not resemble that of Paris, so violent and often so cruel. It is a mild, calm, and tenacious love of private interests, which bit by bit absorbs all other sentiments of the heart and dries up nearly all sources of enthusiasm there. They join to this egoism a certain number of private virtues and domestic qualities which, as a whole, form respectable men and poor citizens.
Royer Collard's reply may well have encouraged Tocqueville in placing this theme at the center of Part 2 of Democracy in America.
You are irritated by the country where you live, but your Normans, they are France, they are the world. This prudent and intelligent egoism, it is the character of the honest folk of our time, trait for trait.
In Part 2, Tocqueville tries to delineate the features of this new mentality that accompanied democracy into the world.
Individualism is a novel expression to which a novel idea has given birth. Our fathers were only acquainted with selfishness. Selfishness is a passionate and exaggerated love of self, which leads a man to connect everything with himself and prefer himself to everything in the world. Individualism is a mature and calm feeling, which disposes each member of the community to sever himself from the mass of his fellows and to draw apart with his family and his friends, so that, after he has thus formed a little circle of his own, he willingly leaves society at large to itself. Selfishness originates in blind instinct. Individualism proceeds from erroneous judgment. Selfishness is a vice as old as the world. Individualism is of democratic origin, and it threatens to spread in the same ratio as the equality of condition.
The underlying cause of this new mentality is the ongoing decay of traditional society. Tocqueville explains this evolution. In former times, an acknowledged and enforced hierarchy had existed, from the lowest to the highest members of the community. Aristocratic society had created smaller groups, which cohered precisely because of the distinctive privileges granted to them. Towns, provinces, social classes, occupational categories, religious bodies, all enjoyed special rights. This created solidarity among their members. But democratic society shreds the whole fabric of an aristocratic society. Professional, religious, and other corporate bodies vanish, as do the bonds between a lord and his vassals, between a landowner and his people. Now, the individual is regarded as the ultimate social unit, with the total right of self-determination. Why should he ever concern himself with the fate of society? Tocqueville thinks individualism should and can be combated. If local liberties are in place, if citizens enjoy the right to decide on public affairs in their own communities, they will tend to be drawn into a wider concern for society at large. The right of free association should be granted, as it is in the United States. For only in association will the individual feel strong enough to resist the encroachments of power. But, Tocqueville observes, the Americans have discovered something even more effective in counteracting individualism without destroying individual independence. They fight individualism with the principle of self-interest itself. That is, rightly understood self-interest.
I do not think, on the whole, that there is more selfishness among us than in America. The only difference is that there it is enlightened, here it is not. Each American knows when to sacrifice some of his private interest to save the rest. The principle of rightly understood self-interest is as often asserted by the poor man as by the rich. The Americans are fond of explaining almost all their actions by this principle. They show how an enlightened regard for themselves constantly prompts them to assist one another and inclines them willingly to sacrifice a portion of their time and property to the welfare of the state.
In America, the individual understands that his own interest is bound up with that of society as a whole. He realizes that he will prosper if the laws are upheld and freedom respected, that he will suffer in the most direct and personal way from despotic government or the breakdown of order. Tocqueville calls enlightened self-interest the chief remaining security that democratic people have against themselves. And yet in the very next chapter he hastens to add that this principle must apply both to life on earth and to the afterlife. That is, the individual restrains his actions not only because he realizes that this serves his enlightened long-range interest in the here and now, but also because of rewards and punishments in the hereafter. Thus, Tocqueville seems to betray a lack of confidence in the idea of enlightened self-interest. Tocqueville was clearly uneasy with the claim that self-interest can be turned into a buttress for free society. The next section of Democracy in America emphasizes the drive for physical gratification and material possessions, chief among American passions. It is a middle-class obsession that has penetrated into all classes. What worries Tocqueville is not that this love of comfort will lead to debauchery and political upheaval. On the contrary, it results in a preference for calmness and tranquility, which are more conducive to acquiring and enjoying material things. But this can undermine character.
To physical gratifications, the heart, the imagination, and life itself are unreservedly given up till, in snatching at these lesser gifts, men lose sight of those more precious possessions which constitute the glory and greatness of mankind. By these means, a kind of virtuous materialism may ultimately be established in the world, which would not corrupt, but dissipate the soul and noiselessly unbend its springs of action.
In the United States, the never-ending race for possessions results in a restlessness, sometimes in an inner emptiness. Fortunately, however, the Americans are educated and politically sophisticated enough to understand the connection between a free government and what they want, wealth.
The Americans believe their freedom to be the best instrument and surest safeguard of their welfare. They are attached to the one by the other. They by no means think that they are not called on to take part in public affairs. On the contrary, they believe that their chief business is to secure for themselves a government which will allow them to acquire the things they covet and which will not debar them from the peaceful enjoyment of those possessions which they have already acquired.
Americans govern themselves not simply by voting, but by executing and scrupulously overseeing the functions of government, especially in their own communities. But what happens if a people is seized by the democratic drive to gain riches, but does not see the connection between wealth and good government? That, Tocqueville says, is the critical moment for freedom.
Men who are possessed by the passion for physical gratification generally find out that the turmoil of freedom disturbs their welfare before they discover how freedom itself serves to promote it. The fear of anarchy perpetually haunts them, and they are always ready to fling away their freedom at the first disturbance.
But even when self-interest is enlightened, and thus no threat to freedom, it still has drawbacks. Above all, it promotes Tocqueville's old bête noire, the lowering of aspirations and a brutalization of the personality. Tocqueville's remedy? Religion. Should a government therefore establish a religion? By no means. The best support that politicians can give to religion, Tocqueville says, is to behave as if they believe in it. In the chapter entitled Why Democratic Nations Naturally Desire Peace and Democratic Armies War, Tocqueville further discusses the pernicious individualism of democracies. His proposition that democratic societies favor peace appeals to common sense. The great majority of people are engrossed by their private interests, above all, by their material interests. War interferes with this. It generates economic uncertainty and demands manifold sacrifices. But the proposition that armies in democratic societies desire war is bolstered only by Tocqueville's claim that democracy multiplies the number of individuals who feel they have a right to a military commission. He claims that since officers' commissions are limited in peacetime, there will be a pressure to wage war to increase them. Tocqueville presents no empirical evidence to support this theory. The most surprising part of his analysis comes next.
I do not wish to speak ill of war. War almost always enlarges the mind of a people and raises its character. In some cases, it is the only check on the excessive growth of certain propensities that naturally spring out of the equality of conditions. And it must be considered as a necessary corrective to certain inveterate diseases to which democratic communities are liable. War has great advantages.
War as a necessary corrective? This is a very different Tocqueville from the saint of ordered liberty so often portrayed. But this Tocqueville is just as real as the other. What could have led this great French liberal to idolize war? The yearning to do great deeds was deeply rooted in Tocqueville's heart. In 1834, he spent a few weeks in the country, something he had not done since he was a child. To a friend, he wrote,
I do not know what I will become, but I feel very strongly that it would be easier for me to leave for China, to enlist as a soldier, or to gamble my life in I know not what hazardous and poorly conceived venture, than to condemn myself to leading the life of a potato, like the decent people I have just seen.
Tocqueville never found an opportunity for heroism. He pursued a mediocre political career and wrote great books. But throughout these books, and in his letters, he expresses profound admiration for heroic characters. Above all, for energetic and passionate characters. The spectacle of grandeur in human personality and action evokes his praise. In his later book, Old Regime and the French Revolution, Tocqueville spoke with feeling of many of the figures of that earlier time.
This spirit of independence kept alive in many individuals their sense of personality and encouraged them to retain their color and relief. More than this, it fostered a healthy self-respect and often an overmastering desire to make a name for themselves. This is why we find in 18th century France so many outstanding personalities, those men of genius, proud and greatly daring, who made the revolution what it was, at once the admiration and the terror of succeeding generations.
Tocqueville respected men of energy and force, sometimes without regard for the good or evil they produced. When Arthur de Gobineau, the founder of the racial theory of history, suggested in a letter that France was a nation in decline, Tocqueville was indignant.
As if, above all, we had not produced a constant stream of great writers during the past 3 centuries, stirring and moving the spirit of mankind most powerfully. Whether in the right or wrong direction may be arguable, but their power one cannot doubt. Strong hatreds, ardent passions, high hopes and powerful convictions are all of them necessary to make human minds move. Right now, nothing is strongly believed. Nothing is loved, nothing is hated, and people wish for nothing but a quick profit on the stock exchange.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette. Tocqueville now contrasts the heroic personality with the kind of man produced by modern society, a man who relentlessly pursues wealth and his private enjoyments. Despite his protestations of impartiality, it is clear that Tocqueville favored the heroic aristocrat and not the democratic individualist. Early in Part 2 of Democracy in America, he sketches the aristocratic attitude.
Aristocracies often commit very tyrannical and inhuman actions, but they rarely entertain groveling thoughts, and they show a kind of haughty contempt of little pleasures, even while they indulge in them. The effect is to raise greatly the general pitch of society. In aristocratic ages, vast ideas are commonly entertained of the dignity, the power, and the greatness of man.
This aspect of Tocqueville's thought is obviously related to many of his idealistic concerns, but it is linked also to his ardor for the imperialism of the European states and his fondness for war. Tocqueville was excited by the prospect of Europe's conquering much of the world, which he foresaw as occurring in the second half of the 19th century. Gobineau, who was a student of Oriental history, had written to Tocqueville predicting the eventual decline of the West. Tocqueville fired back a reply.
You say that one day we shall resemble your Eastern mobs. Perhaps. But before that happens, we shall be their masters. A few million men who, a few centuries ago, lived nearly shirtless in the forest and in the marshes of Europe will, within 100 years, have transformed the globe and dominated the other races. Seldom has Providence shown us an aspect of the future so clearly. The European races are often the greatest rogues, but at least they are rogues to whom God gave will and power, and whom he seems to have destined for some time to be at the head of mankind.
Tocqueville favored imperialism for its civilizing work, but even more for the glory it brought the imperial power. He was particularly stirred by the Raj, the British dominion over India. This brought him into conflict with his friends among the English classical liberals. In 1857, the Sepoy Rebellion, the mutiny of native troops in India, broke out, with appalling massacres on both sides. Nassau Sr. represented the Little England, or anti-imperialist position, which was standard among British liberals. In the summer of 1858, Sr. wrote to Tocqueville,
"The world, I think, is gradually coming over to an opinion which, when I maintained it 30 years ago, was treated as a ridiculous paradox. That India is and always has been a great misfortune to us, and that if it were possible to get quit of it, we should be richer and stronger."
Tocqueville did not directly contradict his old friend, but in a letter to another English correspondent, Lady Theresa Lewis, he was adamant. It made no difference if India cost the British much more than they gained from it, Tocqueville insisted. That was not the point. The writer who had traced the settlement of America by a free people found it possible to say,
"There has never been anything under the sun as extraordinary as the conquest, and above all, the government of India by the English. Anything which from every corner of the globe more attracts the imagination of men to that small island of whose very name the Greeks were unaware. Do you believe, madame, that a people can, after having filled this immense space in the imagination of the human species, withdraw from it with impunity?
Tocqueville was a practical, not just a theoretical proponent of imperialism. As a member of the French Chamber of Deputies, he concerned himself with the pacification of France's latest colony, Algeria. He urged massive French settlement, entailing widespread expropriation of the native inhabitants. Nowhere did he display the kind of sympathy for the Arabs that he had shown for the American Indians. In 1840, France came into conflict with England and other powers over affairs between Egypt and the Turkish Empire. Tocqueville proclaimed that sooner than make concessions, France should threaten to make war. This annoyed and provoked his English friends, especially John Stuart Mill and Nassau Sr. As consistent classical liberals, they could not comprehend how Tocqueville could suggest war with all its attendant horrors unless absolutely necessary. Mill pointed out that true national greatness consisted in love of liberty, of progress, even of material prosperity. Nassau Sr. wrote to chide Tocqueville.
The speech which you addressed to the French Chamber would have been utterly ruinous to any English statesman. What? To think of going to war merely to prevent our being excluded from taking part in the affairs of Syria or Egypt? Or to show that we were not unable to go to war? In the English Parliament, we should consider such proposals as scarcely deserving a serious answer. The passage which you struck out of the address, namely that if you were attacked, you would resist, forms the groundwork of all English feeling on peace and war.
Tocqueville was not moved by the chiding of his friends, nor was he unaware of the grave dangers to liberty that arise from war. In a notebook he had written,
"In order to make war, it is necessary to create a very energetic and almost tyrannical central power. It is necessary to permit it many acts of violence and arbitrariness. War can result in delivering over to this power the liberty of a nation."
Despite this great threat to freedom, Tocqueville believed that imperialism and war should be pursued by statesmen. What can explain this? Tocqueville scorned the small-minded preference for pleasure over greatness of character and achievement. War is the least self-indulgent, the least hedonistic of activities. It represents the ultimate in self-sacrifice. At the same time, it nurtures parts of the personality, like the feeling of comradeship and the sense of honor that raise the individual above himself. As Tocqueville stated before, these are necessary correctives in democratic society. In Part 2 of Democracy in America, he writes,
"What is to be dreaded most is that in the midst of the small, incessant occupations of private life, ambition should lose its vigor and its greatness, that the passions of man should abate, but at the same time be lowered, so that the march of society should every day become more tranquil and less aspiring. I think that the leaders of modern society would be wrong to seek to lull the community by a state of too uniform and too peaceful happiness, and that it is well to expose it from time to time to matters of difficulty and danger in order to raise ambition and give it a field of action."
Tocqueville was committed to energy, passion, and grandeur as values independent of liberty. He believed deeply that sometimes liberty had to be risked for the sake of his aesthetic ideal of human personality. In Part 1 of Democracy in America, Tocqueville had glimpsed the potential for modern tyranny in several different directions. Despotism might come in the form of an all-powerful legislature, or an omnipresent majority, or even a military dictatorship. He also mentioned the possibility of centralization of power in the state apparatus itself, the possibility of an omnipotent bureaucracy. In Part 2, this becomes his overriding fear for the future. His own country was particularly in danger.
"I assert that there is no country in Europe where the public administration has become not only more centralized, but more inquisitive and more minute than in France. Everywhere it interferes in private concerns more than it once did. It regulates more undertakings, and undertakings of a lesser kind, and it gains a firmer footing every day about, above, and around all private persons to assist, to advise, and to coerce them.
Everywhere, the central government seemed to absorb the life of society, in education, in charitable endeavors, even in religious affairs. And in recent years, another whole field had opened up to government encroachment, the new world of industry. Tocqueville has no great interest in economics, business, or technology. There is little mention of these things in Democracy in America. Tocqueville does touch, however, on a momentous question in economics. Is it possible that the new industrial system will generate its own aristocracy in the form of a class of capitalists? The capitalists are not attached to the land, Tocqueville observes. They have no permanent body of followers. And in these ways they differ decisively from the true aristocratic caste of former centuries. But he feels that the new capitalist elite does not show the solicitude for the workers' welfare that his own class had often displayed.
I am of the opinion, on the whole, that the manufacturing aristocracy, which is growing up under our eyes, is one of the harshest that ever existed in the world. But at the same time, it is one of the most confined and least dangerous. Nevertheless, the friends of democracy should keep their eyes anxiously fixed in this direction, for if ever a permanent inequality of conditions and aristocracy again penetrate into the world, it may be predicted that this is the gate by which they will enter.
Beginning in the late 1830s, industrial developments came to the fore in French politics. As a deputy, Tocqueville was aware of the vast potential for bureaucratic abuse in this field. He wrote in a letter,
"In the present century, to deliver over to the government the direction of industry is to surrender to it the very heart of the next generation. It is one more great link added to the long chain that already envelops and presses the individual on all sides."
Tocqueville saw that industry would count for more and more as time went on. The specter of economic control, being added to political domination, almost filled him with despair. The beneficiaries of government aggrandizement were those who carried on the government's business, the bureaucrats. In Democracy in America, he writes,
"In proportion as the functions of the central power are augmented, the number of public offices representing that power must also increase. They form a nation within each nation, and as they share the stability of the government, they more and more fill up the place of an aristocracy."
Tocqueville was well aware of the connection between growing centralization and the growing bureaucratic class. After his trip to America, when he was wrestling with his great themes, Tocqueville wrote to his father asking for his opinion of the prospects for decentralization in France. After all, its advantages for America were indisputable. Tocqueville's father replied that the kind of federation possessed by Americans was unsuitable for France, surrounded by powerful neighbors, yet it was hardly necessary to shunt every local affair to a ministry in Paris. Would there ever be a revival of local liberties? Tocqueville's father, Alexis de Tocqueville, doubted it.
There exist too many persons for whom centralization is profitable, or who hold a position in a central bureaucracy that they would seek in vain elsewhere, for these abuses to be uprooted for a long time. These people have established it as an article of faith that nothing is done well except by the government itself, and they will defend this dogma with obstinacy.
Tocqueville gathered the same view from other sources as well. In England, he spoke with the liberal reformer John Bowring, who was proud of the decentralized system England enjoyed at that time. Of France, however, Bowring said,
"You will never be able to decentralize. Centralization is too good a bait for the greed of rulers. Even those who once preached decentralization always abandon their doctrines on coming to power. You can be sure of that."
Tocqueville identified the social base of this bureaucratic leviathan, the middle class. In his Recollections, written when his political career was over, Tocqueville indicted this middle class that came to power under the monarchy of Louis Philippe.
It entrenched itself in every vacant government position, prodigiously augmented the number of such positions, and accustomed itself to living almost as much upon the public treasury as upon its own efforts.
In the development of the modern state, there was a cancerous growth of government functionaries, largely drawn from the educated middle class. Rather than finding productive occupations in the market sector of society, more and more of the middle class preferred to snare a niche in the bureaucracy. Now, added to this relentlessly spreading central government was the individualism that turns people away from the affairs of their society. Tocqueville discerned a great danger. It was something new in the world. In Democracy in America, he explains,
I seek to trace the novel features under which despotism may appear in the world. The first thing that strikes the observer is an innumerable multitude of men, all equal and alike. Each exists only in himself and for himself alone, and if his kindred still remain to him, he may be said, at any rate, to have lost his country. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power which takes it upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, it prepared men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living?
It is not difficult to see why Tocqueville has been called a prophet, the prophet of mass society. To some commentators, he is able to foresee the rise of totalitarian government. To others, Tocqueville seems to be tracing the modern welfare state, which offers the people cradle-to-grave security, and which Tocqueville would say asks for nothing in return but their freedom. But the fact is that the steady growth of the government, and especially of its bureaucracy, was almost a cliché of political thought in Tocqueville's day. From classical liberals like Thomas Macaulay and Frederick Bastiat to anarchists like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Mikhail Bakunin, the warning was sounded. The expanding state threatens to monopolize all the activities of society. Such a warning was also issued by a man from whom many would hardly expect it, Karl Marx. In 1852, Marx described the French government.
This executive power, with its enormous bureaucracy and military organization, with its ingenious state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, this appalling parasitic body, which enmeshes French society like a net and chokes all its pores, sprang up in the days of the absolute monarchy. Succeeding regimes added to it. Every common interest was straightway severed from society, snatched from the activity of society's members themselves, and made an object of government activity. From a bridge, a schoolhouse, to the railways, the national wealth, and the National University of France. All revolutions perfected this machine, instead of smashing it. As against civil society, the state machine has consolidated its position thoroughly.
The fact that bureaucracy was widely discussed does not detract from Tocqueville's contribution to the vision of the centralized state. He shows that the growing state power was bound up with the rise of democratic society, and particularly with the provision of gratifications to the people. The new despotism would be insidious, he points out, because it would be mild and benevolent. Was there then no hope for freedom under democracy? Tocqueville is far from believing that. True to his deep belief that democracy always shows conflicting tendencies, he now directs attention to democratic values that will help the ongoing struggle for freedom.
The men who live in the democratic ages upon which we are entering have naturally a taste for independence. They are naturally impatient of regulation. They are fond of power, but they are prone to despise and hate those who wield it. These propensities will always manifest themselves because they originate in the groundwork of society. For a long time they will prevent the establishment of any despotism, and they will furnish fresh weapons to each succeeding generation that struggles in favor of the liberty of mankind. Let us, then, look forward to the future with that salutary fear which makes men keep watch and ward for freedom, not with that faint and idle terror which depresses and enervates the heart.
In the last few paragraphs of Democracy in America, Tocqueville takes on one of the most intractable problems of the philosophy of history. Do men have the freedom to decide their own destiny, or are they merely the unknowing agents of deeper forces? He himself seemed to point to men as mere agents at the very beginning of his work, when he described the advance of equality as a providential fact, that is, willed by God. Now, at the end of Democracy in America, his position seems to be more complex.
I am aware that many of my contemporaries maintain that nations are never their own masters, and that they necessarily obey some insurmountable and unintelligible power arising from anterior events, from their race, or from the soil and climate of their country. Such principles are false and cowardly. Such principles can never produce odd but feeble men and pusillanimous nations. Providence has not created mankind entirely independent or entirely free. It is true that around every man a fatal circle is traced, beyond which he cannot pass. But within the wide verge of that circle, he is powerful and free. As it is with man, so with communities.
Tocqueville concludes with a statement that reveals his ultimate aim in analyzing democracy, both in America and in his age.
The nations of our time cannot prevent the conditions of men from becoming equal, but it depends upon themselves whether the principle of equality is to lead them to servitude or freedom, to knowledge or barbarism, to prosperity or wretchedness.
The response of reviewers and of the public to Part 2 of Democracy in America was much less enthusiastic than it had been to Part 1. They seemed to find Tocqueville's use of ideal types and his depictions of the future too speculative and confusing. Tocqueville was hurt and had moments of self-doubt. If he really had any merit as a thinker, how could he have spent 5 years writing a book of such little value? But his friends reassured him, and John Stuart Mill's enthusiastic review filled him with joy. In 1841, he was elected to the French Academy, the peak of the French intellectual world. Tocqueville now aimed for distinction in politics. In a way, this was the logical conclusion of Democracy in America. Now, he would try to do what a statesman could to channel the forces of democracy in the right direction. Tocqueville never became a political leader. In part, this was because of his scruples and his unwillingness to compromise. Beaumont, who served as a deputy with Tocqueville and was a political ally, later reported,
Tocqueville was ambitious. He wished for power. So did I. We would gladly have become ministers. But nothing would have tempted us to sit in a cabinet in which we were constantly outvoted, or to defend, as Guizot did in the chamber, conduct which we had disapproved in the council.
Nassau Sr. stressed other reasons for Tocqueville's lack of success.
His talents and knowledge and courage and character seemed to point him out for a leader. But in the first place, he wants physical strength. As a consequence of this want, he has never practiced the constant debating which is required of the head of a party. And secondly, he is intolerant of mediocrity. He will not court or talk over or even listen to the commonplace men who form the rank and file of every assembly. He scarcely knows their names.
As the years passed, Tocqueville grew increasingly disgusted with French society under the July monarchy. Public-spiritedness, the will to work for the public good, and the maintenance of freedom seemed to have vanished. The lust for wealth, to the exclusion of all else, was noted by other observers of French society, including the cynical and famous novelist Honoré de Balzac.
It is a mistake to believe that it is King Louis-Philippe who reigns, and he himself is not deceived on this point. He knows, just as we do, that above the Constitution stands the holy, venerable, solid, amiable, gracious, beautiful, noble, young, all-powerful 5-franc piece.
Tocqueville saw the intimate links between the scuffling for material gain and the political system of the July monarchy. He wrote to Nassau Sr. in 1847,
"The system of administration that has been practiced for 17 years has so perverted the middle class, by making a constant appeal to the individual cupidities of its members, that this class is gradually becoming, for the rest of the nation, a little corrupt and vulgar aristocracy. But how to prevent the government from corrupting, when the elective regime naturally gives it so much occasion to do so, and centralization so many means?"
For some time, Tocqueville had seen violence coming. In January 1848, he warned his complacent colleagues in the chamber that they were sitting on a volcano. An upheaval was imminent. The issue would not be aristocratic privilege, but property itself. In February, the smoldering dissatisfaction with Louis-Philippe's regime broke out in revolution. A new republic was proclaimed, the Second Republic. But while socialist influence was strong in Paris, the provinces were heavily conservative. For a while, there was an uneasy truce. When elections brought a conservative assembly to power, socialist intellectuals led the Parisian workers in another uprising, called the June Days. Tocqueville, in Paris at the time, wrote frantic letters to his friends in other towns, urging the provinces to hurl themselves at Paris. The Paris insurrection was bloodily suppressed, but everywhere class hatred was palpable. In the aftermath of the June Days, Tocqueville, an enemy of the Reds, as the socialists were called, had reason to fear for his life. Harriet Grote reported an incident Tocqueville had related to her.
He had occasion to stay out somewhat late, returning to his dwelling some time after the inmates of the hotel had retired to rest. The hotel keeper accosted him thus: "Do you know, Monsieur de Tocqueville, that I am very much alarmed at some unaccountable noises which seem to proceed from a building at the farther end of our court. If Monsieur would be so good as to come with me, I should like to know from whence these odd noises proceed."
Tocqueville instantly saw that this was a pretext to entice him to a lonesome spot. "Allons," cried he, "you march first, because you carry the light." At this particular period he habitually carried in his breast pocket a small, loaded pistol, and as he followed the hotel keeper up this long, silent entry, he kept his right hand upon the weapon. Alexis de Tocqueville probably owed his escape from the designs of the Red to his insisting on the latter preceding. He never once suffered the hotel keeper to get near to or behind him, and the latter probably guessed Monsieur de Tocqueville to be ready for him by his keeping his hand on his bosom.
The June days shocked and frightened Tocqueville. Still, he rejected the conservative view that the insurrectionists were nothing but social scum, avid for plunder. He believed they suffered from a prodigious ignorance of economics, and they were too easily persuaded that state control of production would bring them affluence. Beyond that, they had their own ideals. Tocqueville wrote to a friend,
"In the June uprising, there was something other than bad propensities. There were false ideas. Many of these men who were marching towards the overthrow of the most sacred rights were led by a sort of mistaken notion of right. They sincerely believed that society was founded on injustice, and they wanted to give it another basis. It is this kind of revolutionary religion that our bayonets and our cannons will not destroy."
Ideas, Tocqueville believed, must be fought with ideas. Much to Tocqueville's chagrin, in the elections for President of the Republic, the people turned to a candidate they imagined to be a strong man. They turned to Louis Napoleon, nephew of the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and a pretender to the throne. But Louis Napoleon was not content to remain a mere president under the established constitution. In December 1851, he seized control through a coup d'etat. Tocqueville and scores of other liberal deputies were purged from the government. A year later, Louis Napoleon declared himself emperor. Tocqueville was enraged. As he predicted in Part 2 of Democracy in America, the fear of revolutionary disturbances had thrown the people into the arms of a despot. Now, filled with great bitterness, Tocqueville foresaw the downfall of the new Napoleon and his Second Empire. He wrote to Henry Reeve,
"We know this only too well in France. Governments never escape the law of their origins. This one, which arrives by means of the army, which finds its popularity in the memories of military glory, this government will be dragged fatally into wanting territorial expansion, spheres of influence, in other words, war. In war, it will surely find death, but perhaps then its death will cost us very dearly."
Again, Tocqueville was a prophet. In 1870, 18 years after Tocqueville wrote those lines, Napoleon III embroiled his country in war with Prussia and the other German states. This was the Franco-Prussian War. It did indeed cost France very dearly. She quickly succumbed. Napoleon III was overthrown, and in the peace treaty, the new German Reich annexed the French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. This annexation became a major cause of the First World War. When Louis Napoleon declared his emperorship in 1852, Tocqueville grew disillusioned with politics. Considering the poor prospects for social stability, he was close to despair. In his recollections, written around this time but not meant for publication, he wrote,
"Shall we ever attain a more complete and far-reaching social transformation than our forefathers foresaw and desired? Or are we not destined simply to end in a condition of intermittent anarchy, the well-known, chronic, and incurable complaint of old nations. As for me, I am unable to say. I do not know when this long voyage will be ended. I am weary of seeing the shore in each successive mirage, and I often ask myself whether the terra firma we are seeking does really exist, or whether we are not doomed to rove upon the seas forever.
With active politics closed to him, Tocqueville began to entertain the idea of another great literary work. The subject would have direct bearing on the contemporary world. Nothing less could engage his interest and powers. He comforted himself with the thought that political figures rarely advance the good of mankind to any perceptible degree. He wrote with a new excitement to Nassau Sr.
What a vast effect a writer can produce when he possesses the requisite knowledge and endowments. In his study, his thoughts collected, his ideas well arranged, he may hope to imprint indelible traces on the line of human progress. What orator, what brilliant patriot of the Tribune could ever affect the vast agitation of a whole nation's feelings achieved by Voltaire and Jean-Jacques?
Tocqueville selected a subject worthy of his talents, the French Revolution. Others had written on it extensively before him, but Tocqueville's work was more analytical, some would say more sociological. He delved into the provincial archives, into the records of the old regime, to discover what difference the Revolution had actually made in French society. His conclusion? The Revolution made much less difference than had been supposed. In his book entitled The Old Regime and the French Revolution, published in 1856, Tocqueville showed that the process of concentration of power had been going on for centuries. The Revolution and Napoleon had simply continued the work of the French kings. Tocqueville's book is filled with such insight and such finesse in judgment that it has become a classic. Even today, it is a standard reference work of the revolutionary period. Just as with Democracy in America, Tocqueville had an ulterior aim in composing the old regime and the French Revolution. It was the same in both cases. As he stated, it was to show men how to escape tyranny. In his foreword to the old regime and the French Revolution, Tocqueville expressed many of the familiar misgivings on the future of liberty. But now he doubted that religious faith could be a bulwark against tyranny. He had observed with disgust the fervent support the Catholic Church gave to the Second Empire. In the foreword, he observed dryly that the patrimony of the Christian is not of this world. In saying this, Tocqueville approached Jean-Jacques Rousseau's claim that the devout Christian makes a bad citizen. For Tocqueville, the only hope for a good society lay in public spiritedness and citizen participation in government. But how is this to be brought about? Tocqueville does not say. He ends the old regime and the French Revolution with a strike at Napoleon III and his fellow tyrants throughout the ages.
Even despots do not deny the merits of freedom, only they wish to keep it for themselves, claiming that no one else is worthy of it. Thus, our quarrel is not about the value of freedom per se, but stems from our opinion of our fellow men. It is no exaggeration to say that a man's admiration of absolute government is proportionate to the contempt he feels for those around him. I trust I may be allowed to wait a little longer before being converted to such a view of my fellow countrymen.
Tocqueville never finished his work on the French Revolution, although numerous notes and drafts survive. His health was never good, and now it faltered. More and more, he opened his mind to the solace of Catholicism, the religion of his fathers. He tried to grasp the deepest meaning of his life.
I believe that my sentiments and my desires are in excess of my capacities. I believe that God has given me a natural taste for great actions and great virtues, and that despair at never being able to hold on to the grand vision that floats before my eyes, this sadness of living in a world and an epoch that answers so little to that ideal creation in which my spirit loves to dwell. I believe, I say, that these impressions, which age does nothing to weaken, are among the chief causes of this interior malaise of which I have never been able to get the better. But to how many less reputable causes must I not attribute them also?
Alexis de Tocqueville died on April 16, 1859, at the age of 54. The loss was lamented throughout the Western intellectual world. What might he not have discovered of the depths and hidden recesses of modern society in another 15 or 20 years? What would he have thought of the American Civil War prophesied by democracy in America? His friends mourned also the passing of a unique spirit. Mrs. Simpson ended her book on the long years of correspondence and conversations between her father, Nassau Sr., and Tocqueville by describing Tocqueville's resting place.
One day my father and I visited the little green churchyard on a cliff near the sea where Tocqueville is buried. The tombstone is a plain grey slab. On it a cross is cut in bas-relief with these words only: "Here rests Alexis de Tocqueville, born the 24th of February, 1805, died the 16th of April, 1859. My father made a wreath of immortelles on the tomb.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation of Democracy in America by Knowledge Products. The script for Democracy in America is by Ralph Rayco, edited by Wendy McElroy. The producer is Pat Childs. Narration is by Craig Deichman. Vocal characterizations are by Pat Childs, Dan Church, Travis Hardison, Jean LeBlanc, and Paul Meyer. Music is by Ralph Childs. Recorded at Archer Productions. This material may not be copied in whole or in part without the written permission of the copyright owner. Copyright 1987 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated.